die wegsneeuw. Toe vlug ik naar die kant van die Oppingtonse zand, daaronder bij de grote rivier. O, breng mij terug naar die oude Transvaal, daar waar mijn Sarre woont. Daaronder in die milies bij die groendoornboom.
Carbineers at the ready! Sir! At ease, Carbineers. It's your old friend, Chetty Carter. Hi guys, just relaxing on a Sunday afternoon. Got the old lamps going, reading South Africa and the Transvaal War. I've got my old mate, President Kruger, with me, Oom Paul. Of course, by this stage of the war, he's off in Europe trying to get support and money for the Boer cause. He's rallying around the European nations, asking for money and for support, a bit like our friend President Zelensky is doing at the moment. So last episode we looked at the execution of Floris Visser. He was a young guy, you know, he was a 20-year-old Boer that had been shot in the ankle. He would have walked with a limp for the rest of his life. But he was unable to escape with the rest of them, so he was taken by the Carbineers, given a Bushveldt court-martial, which he didn't even attend, and he was shot by firing squad. There's some contention, did he actually even have Captain Hunt's British warm, his jacket? Was he wearing British khaki? It seemed foolhardy if he was. Surely if you heard the shooting and you knew they were coming down to attack your lager, the first thing you'd do would be get the jacket off you. But so there's some contradiction whether he was actually wearing the Captain Hunt's uniform. The joiner, Buerta, reckoned that that Lieutenant Morant was wearing it from the very start, that he had all of Hunt's uniform that he wore. So it's getting a bit brutal out there, isn't it? Morant has really taken it on as a personal vendetta. So the episode we're going to see today, I'm calling, My God, Harry, You've Gone Too Far, or words to that effect. We're going to hear about these Boers that came in to surrender. Now in the movie it's implied that they were the remnants of the Lieut party, that they had been at the Davil's Kloof. I have to describe these scenes because for some reason these have been picked up on copyright, which showing parts of the movie on the other episodes is never done. But anyway, so what's going on is they've brought these Boer prisoners in. They've got them in what they call like a bird cage at Fort Edward, and anyway this is where the breaker says that they were involved in the murder of Captain Hunt, that they're part of Lieut's commando. What's to be done with them? And the final word is Captain Taylor says, execute them. The firefight broke out and Captain Hunt and Sergeant Eland were killed. But in Charles's book, in his telling of what happened, there's no mention, I think, of them ever being considered as participants in that. More likely what's going on is we're heading towards the end of the war, and these Boers out in the veldt, they're starving, their farms have been burnt, Mujahideen are attacking and harassing their wives and their children. They're being sent down to the prisoner of war camps. The wives and the children and even some of the men are being shipped off to St. Helena, or they're being held in concentration camps. There's no food, they've got no blankets. We heard in the last episode that Morant says they don't even have blankets anymore. They're what they call the bitterenders, which is the bitter enders. They're going to fight till the very end. Well, some of them are, but these guys are coming in from the veldt. They're starving, they've got no clothes. And they're met just outside near Elam Hospital, which Charles showed me. There's still a hospital there at Elam, and not far from Fort Edward. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This actually involves two stories, because it also involves the Reverend Heath, Daniel Heath, which we're going to hear more of in the next episode. But he sees those prisoners and he talks to them. And Morant, he no like that. So I suspect that even the Carbineers out of Fort Edward, I suspect they're getting low on rations. One of the reasons Morant gives for executing them is that they don't have the provisions to feed them. He doesn't want to share his provisions with Boer prisoners, so he has them shot. But one of the defences in the court case, which we'll also hear about later on in this series, is that he was ordered to shoot Boer prisoners, but there were plenty of other Boer prisoners that were sent from Fort Edward down to Petersburg. Got my mug here, by the way. I've been enjoying a beverage in my Petersburg Club mug. So yeah, there were plenty of prisoners that were sent down to Petersburg. So why were these ones executed? That's one of the flaws in Morant's argument in the court-martial. Anyway, it's another cracking story. I didn't see this particular grave site. I did see another one that we'll be seeing in one of the other episodes. But I think this grave site they had only recently found, or when I say recently, about 10 years ago, they'd found the grave site for these 8 Boers. You all know the drill now. Water your horses. Get your bandoliers full of 303 cartridges. Make sure you got your British warms on. You got your dungarees and your leggings, because we're riding out to the Spelonken. Your British warm jackets, because it gets cold out there in the Spelonken. Trust me, even when I was over there, I got a bit chilly one day. So saddle up, Carbineers. Here's another cracking story for you. On we go. So life at Fort Edward appeared to be settling down and even sort of returning to what you could call normal after the night attack on the Lieut homestead. There were patrols still bringing in more captured Boers and the odd bit of indiscipline amongst the troops. Actually, Corporal Sharp had to be disciplined for apparently selling his uniform to an unnamed and unidentified buyer, presumably a Boer. That seems pretty radical. But anyway, the start of our story comes from a scout or an agent. Could I call him a joiner? Maybe. Leonard Henry Lieut. He joined the British Army Intelligence Department. That'd be working underneath Captain Taylor. And on about the 20th of August, he sent in this report that 8 Boer prisoners had surrendered to him and Trooper A.S. Petrie of the Bushveldt Carbineers, and they were coming to the fort as prisoners, right? And they were to the east of Elam Hospital, maybe in the vicinity of Fonseca's store. Yeah, this is simply the scene where the Boers are coming in under white flag to surrender, although Handcock thinks it's a trick. But, yeah, once again, it's copyrighted. Not far from where Leader Boer's father-in-law, Monty, lived. So Sergeant Wrench, J.C. Wrench, commanding a patrol of 8 men, one of whom was Trooper B.J. Bevan, was sent to intercept and take charge of this group of Boer prisoners from Leader Boer. We're going to see a photo of Leader Boer. He lived quite a long life, apparently. He seemed to end up in the Kruger National Park as a scout or something. So Corporal Albert van der Westhuizen reminded Sergeant Wrench that Lieutenant Morant had cautioned the patrol not to bring in any more Boers lest they be required to share their rations with the prisoners. That's what I said in the intro, that rations were getting short at Fort Edward. So having taken over the group of surrendered Boers, Sergeant Wrench's patrol proceeded as far as Elam Hospital, where they were met by Lieutenants Morant, Handcock and Witton. There's that unholy trio, eh? Together with Sergeant Major Hammett and Troopers Thompson and Duckett. Well, you know you're in trouble when you see those three approaching you. So Wrench's group was instructed by Morant to go on ahead to Fort Edward as an advance guard. Whilst halted at Elam Hospital, the group of prisoners was noticed by the visiting Reverend Hees of the Berlin Mission Society in Potgietersrus. So Hees was at the hospital because he had a friend that was he'd come into the hospital with him. But we won't go too much into the Reverend at the moment. Suffice to say, he gets himself into trouble for talking to these prisoners. So the next episode we'll hear more about the Reverend Hees. But we'll say this. So Reverend Hees and his underbelly driver were about to go back to Potgietersrus when they noticed the group of 8 prisoners, which included one of his friends, W.D. Vaarmeyer, a young Dutch schoolteacher on a teaching contract funded from Amsterdam. There seemed to have been at least 4 Dutch school teachers in this group of 8. I don't think they were combatants. I think, I don't know, we'll find out why they were hanging around with these Boer prisoners. So Vaarmeyer was the principal of the Emmanuel School in Potgietersrus, quite close to Reverend Hees's mission station. That's how they knew each other. They were good friends and they engaged in conversation, and the Reverend learned that the group of 8 prisoners had spent the night in the hospital grounds. This group of prisoners included Vaarmeyer and 3 other Dutch school teachers, 2 of whom were also stationed in Potgietersrus, and they also knew the Reverend, right? So the 4th Dutch teacher, Westerhof, had been the principal of the school in Petersburg. And Hees was quick to realise that all was not well with this group and that their lives could be in danger. So you might ask, what were school teachers on teaching contracts from Holland doing at Elam Hospital so far away from their schools? Well, the reason was the schools were closed as the children had been put into the concentration camps. And these teachers, mainly non-combatants, were just biding their time and trying to avoid contact with any British patrols while the war was still in progress. That seems kind of a dangerous way of thinking. Anyway, on with the story. So we're going to hear from the Reverend's widow, Johanna. She wrote this to the Berlin Mission Society. This would be after the death of her husband. But it's pertinent to the prisoners, so we'll read it now. I don't know if we'll read it again in the next episode as well, but we'll read it now. So she says, "My husband Daniel had risen with the sun on the morning of the fatal day and had gone to inspect the hospital buildings at Elam. As he turned a corner, he saw a wagon with 8 Boers who had surrendered, that is, had given up their arms and were now, as they thought, to be taken to some sort of camp. They were guarded by Lieutenants Murray and Handcock of the Sweetwaters camp and some Australian soldiers who were laying in the grass." She probably means Morant when she says Murray. Daniel, that's her husband, recognised one of the prisoners as the head of schoolmaster of our village, an extremely nice Dutchman named Vaarmeyer. Daniel went straight up and spoke to him. The schoolmaster said that he and the other prisoners were very uneasy as to their ultimate fate, although they had surrendered voluntarily. Daniel confronted them by telling them that nothing could happen to them. The guards became angry with Daniel for speaking to the prisoners and ordered him to get up onto the wagon and consider himself a prisoner. Daniel refused, saying they might have prevented him approaching the prisoners, but he was in possession of a pass from the commander at Petersburg, allowing him to travel freely, and promised to report himself at the camp and bring his passport with him. So the prisoners were then removed and Daniel went to lunch with some friends. On hearing all that had happened, they were terribly frightened and did their best to persuade him to stay in their house for the next 2 days, but he had promised to report himself in the camp that evening and nothing would induce him to break his word. Between Elam and the camp, something unheard of happened. The prisoners were all shot by their guards, who thereupon went on their way, leaving some coloured men to bury the victims. The 8 Boers were shot and buried beside the old transport road near the boundary of the farm Ballymore. Okay, so Daniel, that's the Reverend, passed by shortly after, and he must have seen the result of the crime. What was said or done in the camp we will never know, but the culprits would be sure that Daniel would not keep the affair a secret. Nevertheless, they allowed him to proceed on his way, only ordering him to attach a white flag to his wagon, which he did. Oh, well, that's all I want to read of that letter, because that references the prisoners and the Reverend's interaction with them, right? The actual killing of the Boers and 3 black witnesses, we often forget that there were also blacks, Africans, drivers and workers that were also executed by the Carbineers. They don't even get names mentioned. No one bothered to document who the names of these Africans were. Described by depositions of troopers who were present. One of those troopers was Corporal Albert van der Westhuizen, Bushveldt Carbineers number 79, who Davy quotes as having deposed as follows. So, quote, 8 Boers were reported by leader Boer of the intelligence and Trooper Petrie as having surrendered. I did not know them all, but among them were Carl Smith, could be Schmidt, Wutkom, and Depress, which could be Dupree. I knew Carl Smith had a nice farm not far from Petersburg. A patrol of 8 men and a sergeant were told off to go out and meet them. The sergeant was Sergeant Wrench. The men were troopers Cox, Willem Mueller, Bevan, Kidd, Marrett, Leeds, one other and myself. Before starting from Sweetwater's farm, Lieutenant Morant told us that if we brought the Boers in as prisoners, we would have to find food out of our own rations, and he would give none. We brought them to within 4 or 5 miles from the fort, when we were met by Lieutenants Morant, Handcock and Witton. Lieutenant Morant ordered Sergeant Wrench and his men to leave the wagon with the prisoners in his charge and go on about a mile ahead. If you hear shots in front of you, gallop back to the wagon. He also told us to scout as we went along, as a large number of Boers were close at hand. We did not scout as we knew this to be all moonshine. I think he means bullshit. We rode leisurely along the road. We travelled about 3/4 of a mile when we heard 3 shots which were fired by Messrs. Leader Boer and Schwartz of the intelligence attached to the Bushveldt Carbineers. We met them with their rifles, so we knew that they fired the shots. These shots were fired in accordance with a prearranged plan in order to simulate a Boer attack. Immediately we heard those 3 signal shots in front of us. We heard the volley fired to our rear, and we knew that the prisoners were being shot. I reckon Mr. Leader Boer was in the plot. Carl Smith, one of the murdered prisoners, showed me a letter the day before he was killed to the effect that Mr. Hash, Monty, also known as Monty Ash, they were a family that had been living and farming in the Levibu Valley, just east of the hospital in Fort Edward, and that was Leader Boer's father-in-law, owed him, that's Carl Smith, £130. After hearing the shots, we rode on. I guess that's how you get out of paying your debts, have them shot. By Sweetwater's farm, we met Captain Taylor. There he is, old Bulala. He's got to be around, hasn't he, sniffing blood. He asked Sergeant Wrench if he heard any shots. Sergeant Wrench, for private reasons, said no, as he didn't know what Captain Taylor would do if he said he had heard them. Captain Taylor said, all right, go on to the fort and off saddle. Besides the span of donkeys drawing the wagons, there were 20 or 30 cattle in good condition. I never saw these cattle again and do not know what became of them. They were never driven to the fort. The wagons, which was a good one, was left at Captain Taylor's place. Well, you can bet Taylor's taken the cattle and sent them up to Rhodesia, right? Of course. In the afternoon, Lieutenant Morant sent in 3 African boys who were driving the wagons and the loose cattle. We knew the Africans would be shot if we brought them in, so we did not try to find them, and when we returned, we reported we could not find them. When the missionary, the Reverend Mr. Heath, passed the fort, Lieutenant Morant jumped on his horse bareback and galloped up the road to overtake the missionary, who was driving a cart drawn by 2 mules. After speaking to the missionary, he came galloping back to the fort. He called out for Mr. Handcock. Oh, I'm not going to go into that because that will be the next episode. But once again, that's a so this has been witnessed by W. Bonham, a captain, Assistant Provost Marshal, Army Headquarters, Pretoria, the 14th of October 1901. This is all the evidence that's been given towards the court-martial, and this was by Westhuizen, right? So Charles says, once again, there's conflicting evidence as to whether Lieutenant Morant and his patrol had met the group at Elam Hospital, or whether he intercepted them near the crossroads on Ballymore, also known in those days as Mogoluli. Okay, so this is going to be now Lieutenant Witton's account from his book, The Scapegoats of the Empire, and it differs a bit in the details. So this is what Lieutenant Witton says, and I will give a link to my interview with Lieutenant Witton's great nephew some stage in this episode. We'll talk a bit about Lieutenant Witton. So, quote, a patrol subsequently set out comprising Lieutenants Morant, Handcock and myself. Sergeant Major Hammett, who had gone out with me to the Spelonken, and 2 troopers. We first called at the office of Captain Taylor. Morant dismounted and had a private interview with that officer. I was not informed as to the nature of it. I was not then on intimate terms with Lieutenant Morant. I had only met him for the first time a fortnight previously as my superior officer, and had recognised him as such, and during that fortnight I'd been frequently away from the fort. So I don't know what made Morant superior to Lieutenant Witton. They're all lieutenants. Perhaps it's because Morant is older. Maybe it's an age thing. But Morant seems to be in charge of Lieutenants Handcock, Picton and Witton. Anyway, we go back on to Witton's account in his book. Quote, we went on and Morant said that it was his intention to have the prisoners shot. Both myself and Sergeant Major Hammett asked Morant if he was sure he was doing right. He replied that he was quite justified in shooting the Boers. He had his orders, and he would rely upon us to support him. I also afterwards remonstrated with him for having the prisoners brought in and shot so close to the fort, but he said it was a matter of indifference where they were shot. We met the patrol with the prisoners about 6 miles out. Morant at once took charge and instructed the escort to go ahead as an advance guard. The prisoners were ordered to inspan and trek to the fort. I rode on in front of the wagon, and I did not see any civilians speak to the prisoners as we were passing the mission hospital. When we trekked on about 3 miles, Morant stopped the wagon, called the men off the road and questioned them. Upon his asking, have you any information to give, they were shot. There's a couple of problems with this scene. For a start, there should be 8 prisoners about to be executed. They weren't done up against a wall. But anyway, that's the scene of the execution in the movie, which copyrighted. One of them, a big powerful Dutchman, made a rush at me and seized the end of my rifle with the intention of taking it and shooting me, but I simplified matters by pulling the trigger and shooting him. I never had any qualms of conscience for having done so, as he was recognised by Lieut, the intelligence agent, as a most notorious scoundrel who'd previously threatened to shoot him and was the head of a band of marauders. By just escaping death in this tragedy, I was afterwards sentenced to suffer death. I went on with the men, and we took with us the wagon and the belongings, which we handed over to Captain Taylor. Well, there you go. Taylor gets all the goodies. Anyway, I then went on to the fort. Morant and Handcock remained behind to make arrangements for the burial of the bodies. So neither Leader Boer's opinion and description of the big powerful Dutchman, with which Witton used to justify his actions, nor Witton's own description of his act of self-defence tally with the following report described by Emily Hobhouse. Now, I don't know if you know who Emily Hobhouse is, but she came out with a committee to investigate the conditions of the women and children in the concentration camp. She's idolised in South Africa. I think she might even be buried at the Women's Memorial at the Bloemfontein Boer War Museum. Anyway, she spoke to them in the British Parliament. She opened the eyes to the public of what was going on in that war, and opinion turned. Anyway, this is what Emily wrote. Last night I went to see Mrs. Vermeer. Her husband, the schoolmaster of P.P. Rust, was one of those murdered men on whose account the German missionary Mr. Heese protested and was in turn himself killed. Mrs. Vermeer, a quiet, white-faced woman, told me all she knew of her husband's death. She'd come into town for Nachtmaal, which is Holy Communion. Mr. Vermeer, a Hollander but naturalised burgher, was with a party of friends, 8 in all. These were Mr. Beaucamp and son, young de Pries, Mr. Lochner, Mr. Wouters, Mr. Carl Smit and Mr. Westerhoff, also a Hollander schoolmaster of Petersburg. They'd surrendered and their arms were given up. One of them was sick with malaria. It is said that Handcock, finding the sick man impeding progress, ordered him to be shot. National Scout one Botha said if one was shot, all must be, lest the remainder tell. This was agreed to, and the order was given to an English soldier, a corporal or a sergeant, to dispatch the 8. He refused and protested. One man, Carl Smit, he was the deacon of the church, begged to be shot with his eyes uncovered and with one bullet. So that's what Emily wrote. Says here, Carl Smit, after being wounded by that one bullet, rushed at the soldier who fired the shot. That soldier's name is given as Captain Taylor, who had stated categorically that he had not been present. So that's probably the incident with Witton. Things are getting a bit confused. So growing up, how much did you know about George Witton?
I never knew anything about him until I was about 18 or 19 because my relatives, like my mother died when I was born, so there was no mention of the Witton family because of that. And it was about 19, I would have been about 18 or 19 when I first heard about it. And then I thought, oh, this guy's probably not a relative of ours. Then I decided to go into it a bit more. I decided to go into it a bit more and found out that, yes, he was related, you know. And
he's on your mother's side, is he?
On my mother's side, yeah. As far as I know, going through the history of the family, my grandfather and George Witton's father were brothers.
So it's been confirmed that the Boer who lunged at Witton was indeed C.P.J. Schmidt. The following extract makes further reference to the opportunistic motives of certain British or colonial combatants stationed at Fort Edward. It says, a Boer by the name of Smith, who had a valuable farm in the area, was shot because one of the officers coveted his farm and openly stated that when the war was over he was going to apply for Smith's farm. I don't know where that throws Witton's testimony in, but anyway, Witton was acquitted of that charge, of that incident. Anyway, back to Charles's book. So he says at the end of 2009, Charles, the author, accompanied by 4 enthusiasts, was guided to the site of the massacre by 3 senior black staff members of the present owners of Sweetwaters. So once again, that's the hotel where Taylor had his headquarters, and I showed you a bit of that in the previous episodes. So Mr. Poor Henning, he's the owner of the hotel, was the last known person to photograph the grave previously, with the late Piet Elof and Dr. Karl Schulenberg in about 1981. The burial place is on the side of a low hill, and though there is not much of an incline, the ground is fairly stony. The original sandstone grave marker has been badly damaged and broken up over the years by local people who sharpen their axes and knives on the sandstone. Are they the Mujahideen? Love those guys. A very scarce commodity in the area, and then they've broken off bits and pieces to take home. The engraved heading and parts of 2 of the 8 names is all that remains legible. An area of about 20 metres square was fenced off in about 1960 by R.F. Botha and S.J. Lee, both teachers and historians, assisted by a group of scholars. I'm going to show you a photo now of when they rediscovered the grave in 2009. Left to right is Kobus Holzenkamp, Corrie Juster, Jan and Marike van Braak. So this was done to protect the sacred area, which is covered by stones from disturbance by grazing cattle and other animals. This is where the 8 men were buried. It's unlikely that one single grave large and deep enough to accept all 8 bodies would have been dug with hand tools in such stony ground. It's more probable that several shallow graves would have been excavated over the wide area and then covered with stones to prevent scavengers from disturbing the remains. Before it was damaged, the gravestone bore the same heading as all the other official headstones, followed by the relevant names. And I'll give you a photo of all that remains of the headstone. It says Helden van Zuid-Afrika vir Vaderland en Vryheid 99-02. That's what we saw on that other headstone that I showed you guys in the previous episodes. It's got Smit, Lochena, Bagens, Warmeyer, Westerhof, Wouters, De Vries. Smit is the one shot by Witton. Warmeyer is the headmaster. And it says Heroes of South Africa, Fatherland and Freedom. That's the translation, right? So one name was unknown at the time and was thus omitted. However, his name, Pawski, was confirmed by the Anglo-Boer War Museum in Bloemfontein. Here's a photo of Dr. Karl Schulenberg and Mr. Piet Elof at the grave of the 8 Boers in April 1981. So because at least 6 of these victims were not from the area, their identities were not known at the time. As a result, confusion was caused by the incorrect spelling of 3 of the surnames, so much so it was implicitly believed by locals that there were actually 3 additional Boers shot at Ballymore that same day. The confusion of the names has now been cleared by the museum in Bloemfontein as follows. There was nobody with the name Bouwkamp, only with the name Bouwkens. The rumour of the 3 additional Boer victims was probably started by the fact that the mounted officers had chased 3 black attendants or herdsmen onto the neighbouring farm of Charlie Bristow and shot them in one of his cattle pens. After more than 100 years, it's unlikely that either the cattle pens or the grave of these 3 unknown witnesses will ever be found. Yeah, that's the thing with the Africans or the black attendants. They were gunned down without any effort to preserve their names or give them a proper grave. Yeah, so maybe the officers regarded them as witnesses and a potential problem, so that's probably why they shot the African attendants. So here's where they got that reference in the movie that they were somehow involved in the incident with Captain Hunt's death. So according to Charles, the Carbineers immediately claimed that the 8 Boer victims were members of the Viljoen Commando and had thus been responsible for the death of Hunt and the suspected mutilation. Again, it's noted that the Bushveldt Carbineers command structure seldom, if ever, bother to identify their victims or ascertain their supposed crimes before gunning them down. Here's another photo of the grave taken in 1980. The handwritten inscription written in Afrikaans on the reverse side translates as Boers found at Ballymore, graves self-dug before they were shot. So this is a photo, and the guy's written that on the reverse side of the photo. So it's claimed by local legend that the 8 Boers had been forced to dig their own individual graves. The firing squad that shot the 8 Boers included Witton, who pulled the trigger at Smit when he lunged at him, J.T. Arnold, Edward Brown, T. Dale, J. Eden, A. Heath, D. Oldham, who served under Captain Robinson,
He gave the order for the firing party to shoot, but he was much disturbed by it. VC Primrose and F. Stevens, both members of the patrol but not of the firing party. And that's the execution of the 8 Boers.
O breng mij terug naar die oude Transvaal, daar waar mijn Sari woont. Daar onder in die middels bij die groen doornboom, daar woont mijn Sari maar.